Hello and welcome to episode number 15 of the Crisis Intelligence Podcast. Today is Sunday, September 14th, 2014. I'm Melissa Agnes, and this podcast is brought to you by Agnes Day. Let's talk crisis intelligence. Welcome to the show, Chris. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about what you do?
Well, my name is Chris Syme, and I currently run an agency called Syme Media Group out of Bozeman, Montana, and San Diego, California. I'm a former media relations person at the higher ed level, have my master's in athletic administration, did my thesis actually in crisis management in college athletics that was a long time ago. And so I work mostly with higher ed athletic departments, some NGOs, not, governmental agencies and nonprofits, but the bulk of my work is in higher ed, and I do a lot of crisis management on the social media end. Sometimes contractors will bring me in to monitor crisis on social media because they don't have the personnel to do so. I also do a lot of social media training, especially a lot for higher ed athletics, and that in kind of a nutshell is what I do. And who I am.
Keeping you busy, and you have a great blog that I follow that really touches on some important points regularly, actually.
Oh, thank you.
Especially for the student athletes. So I think what I wanted to talk to you about today was two areas that you really seem to specialize in from all of the things that you post and publish and share online. And that is basically what you just said, is the social media training prior to a crisis, for crisis, and social media monitoring in a crisis, which are two really important topics and also two big question marks that I find that professionals kind of don't know where to begin.
And I hear that a lot too.
I bet you do. I bet you do. So let's talk about the training first. So everybody, it's a common thing right now to go through social media training for marketing and PR and, communications for the organization. What in specific would you change or do you address when you do social media training for crisis preparedness? And who do you train?
Well, that's a great question, Melissa. Basically, I think I approach this in two different ways. I usually like to train staff separately from users and by staff I mean community manager types, people that are actually on the front lines of executing social media, because they need to, as you know very well, they need to be trained in a different sort of way. They need to understand issues management, escalation, all those kinds of things, how to spot the smoke, before the fire kind of thing. And then I also train a lot of user groups, and that is especially true in college athletics, where I'm training student athletes and coaches how to use social media responsibly. And so those are kind of the two ways, if we're talking about crisis PR, that I would go in and work with groups. I want to make sure that it's not just users, because I know a lot of brands are worried about, we can't have our people, being bad on Twitter. And I get that, I understand that. And yeah, that's a very important part of it, representing your brand in social media. But also, I think the most overlooked piece in this whole pie, if you will, is the training of community managers, because there's kind of this dichotomy, if you will. We hire people based on their social media skills. So you can be, and you know this, you can be really savvy using social media, understand all the platforms, get all the analytics and all that stuff, but you don't know how to spot trouble. And so I'm talking to brands more and more about training community managers, actually.
For spotting that trouble.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes, I think it's really important, issues management. How do you... Let's talk specifically about issues escalation, for instance, and I know you know a lot about this. When I go in and train community managers, we want to teach people how to know when an issue needs to be left alone or when it needs to be addressed. And then you also need to look at things like volume. How many posts are there out there? You need to look at sentiment. When I'm monitoring pre-crisis, because sometimes I get called in by brands that know they've got to have this big press conference in a week or so. So they want me to monitor before, during, and after. So I'll actually take a thermometer test, if you will, the sentiment pre-crisis. Then when the news breaks, then we start measuring sentiment escalation. So as long as I can see that the sentiment escalation is normal, and what I mean by that is, you know how it is in a crisis, you expect issues to escalate. I think that's isn't that the hardest thing to tell business people that that's going to happen? I mean, it's almost like they're wringing their hands the first negative comment that's out there, because maybe they actually did something negative, and I guess they don't think people are going to talk about it. But the first negative comment that comes out there, they just want to shut the whole thing down. Oh, we're going to be quiet. We're not going to, and I'm like, well, you can do that, but it's actually going to be worse for you. And, you've seen this a lot too. People actually think the quieter you are during a crisis, maybe people just go away.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really work that way. So we look at I think one of the things that I bring to the table, if you will, for these people is I understand the escalation cycle of a crisis. So I can really kind of hold their hand, coach them through this, let them know that if we do A, B, C, and D, which are things that you can do, to manage the escalation of a crisis, that it will eventually go away and you may actually be better on the other end. But you have to kind of grit your teeth and clench your fists when this stuff starts to happen, and just watch it. And you know how that goes.
I do. And it's interesting that you're bringing it up. I read an article this week, actually, and I won't point any name or, pick on anybody, but from somebody in the field of crisis management. And it was talking about how in a crisis, when, the naysayers come on and start attacking your brand, that say on Facebook, for example, that in some cases it's better just to shut down Facebook. And, it's hard for me as to do what I do and to write what I write and teach what I teach, and then to see a crisis professional who's actually advocating to shut down Facebook, when exactly what you're saying, that yes, it's hard, and yes, the naysayers can be very loud, but the consequences of shutting down your page and trying to hide from what's the reality is and what's going on and what's going to go on no matter whether you have your page or not, and that's the reality, is very hard for me to watch and to read. So I like that you're saying this, and that you're bringing it up in a way that people listening can relate to, because it's them on that end of the situation.
Right. And you know why they do that. I mean, there's a couple of reasons why, but I think the main reason people do that is because they've screwed up and they don't want to or know how to fix it. And like, let's just take, for instance, you remember, I can't remember if it was last year, remember the McDonald's hashtag that went awry?
Oh, yeah, make these stories.
Yeah, and so my thing is, you get that you did something wrong, and so, yeah, it needs to be shut down, but you can't just shut it off. You have to let it play out, and then you have to talk about why it was wrong. You have to admit to your constituents that this probably wasn't the best way to go about that. I'm just thinking, too, this week, Florida State University, who has a young quarterback that was a Heisman winner last year, Jameis Winston. They put him on kind of on the spot. He's had some trouble, off the field troubles in the last year, and they decided that they were going to put him on a Twitter Q&A live with fans, and it backfired on them. And it's almost like I can't figure out why you don't look at that ahead of time. And see that, you might have trouble. So this is a long story to go around what you just said, and saying that oftentimes when I see people do that, and I've got a great story sometime we'll have to talk about it, of a client that had a issue that went globally viral, and how we dealt with that on Facebook. Sometimes you just have to have the courage to be able to look at this ahead of time and kind of go through it and think, we can't do this because, and then after you try it and it doesn't work, you have to be willing to say, we didn't do this right. We need to just, take our medicine or whatever and get through it and go on to the next thing. But I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to go through something like that. For instance, be curious about the numbers, but I'm not sure that McDonald's business took a major hit over that.
I love that case in particular because, first of all, when organizations put out these hashtag campaigns or Q&As on Twitter, what they think that it's going to be really fun they only think of the positive. They don't really, I wrote a blog post last week, I believe, well, it won't be last week by the time that this airs, but about how every single communication, every single marketing campaign, every single PR campaign needs to go through a risk assessment. And this is exactly why it's cases like these and stories like these that make me sit back and say, but how come you didn't ask yourself the question of what could go wrong? And how can we either fix it in the case of, or prevent it? In the case of McD stories, hashtag campaigns are very easy to be brand jacked. So, and that's a reality. They were one of the first ones to experiment with it. So, lessons need to be learned. And I agree with you 100% that you need to come back and then say, oh, you know what? We didn't think it through properly. We learned our lesson. And here's what other organizations can learn from us as well, from the experience that we went through. So share that and build a community around that experience rather than hiding from it. But the hashtag campaign in particular, it was too neutral. So had they sat around a table and said, okay, we're going to launch this, what can go wrong? Well, it could be McD stories good. It could be McD stories bad. Unfortunately, it got hijacked and was very, very negative. But had they changed it and said, okay, well, if that's the case, what if we said hashtag happy McD to encourage happy stories? Where you kind of make it as positive as you can. It's still a risk, but there's less risk when you dictate the narrative or ask for the sentiment that you're looking for. So it's a very interesting case study, and they all are in terms of these organizations that they have the good intention. They want to make themselves maybe not as vulnerable as they realize that they're making themselves, but it's the whole point of engaging with their community. And they just don't think ahead of time and say, okay, well, what could go wrong and how can we either prevent it or plan for it if we can't prevent it, and if we deem it still necessary or still appropriate and still worthwhile to go through with.
Right. I agree totally about risk analysis for campaigns. I think sometimes we overlook that. Some people have risk analysis that they go through maybe on an annual basis for the brand, but they don't really think it through for campaigns. One of the, you might have heard of this book, but there's a great book out called Blind Spots, Why We Fail to Do What's Right. It's by Max Bazerman and Anne, I'm going to not do her name well. I think it's Tenbrussel. And they wrote a couple of case studies that went back to the Catholic Church debacle, the child molestation and some of that stuff. But it was before Penn State happened. And I happened to do a pretty lengthy case study on Penn State after that incident there. And this book really helped me to understand that how important it is to do blind spot risk analysis. Because and ever since this book came out and I read it, kind of had an epiphany of sorts. And I thought, when I go in and do a risk analysis, even a communications risk analysis for a brand ahead of time, I'm looking more at the logistical, technical point of view than I'm ever looking at what could be their blind spots. Because in order to really find those, you have to do a lot of digging, and it's sometimes uncomfortable. Nobody likes to admit that they're good old boy network, or that they like themselves more than they like their customers. I mean, nobody likes to admit those kinds of things, but it's so key that we as crisis management people help our clients understand that they have to look in the mirror. And they have to face the fact that maybe we're not thinking as clearly about this campaign as we should. It's kind of a rabbit trail, if you will, and we could go off on that. But I think it's really important. It's the most difficult part of risk analysis, I find, is to really get into people's heads and ask them point blank, what do you do that you think might get you into trouble? What do you do on a regular basis that probably isn't a good practice?
Absolutely. And it is hard. It's hard for individuals to self-evaluate personally, never mind when they feel like, oh, maybe my job might be on the line, or maybe if I bring this to, higher up management's attention that I might be reprimanded. One thing that I like to say when I'm conducting these sorts of analyses is that if you can think it, it can happen. And that's the fact
great.
Today.
That's a great point.
So, and that kind of, I like to take it away from the people putting it on to people and just saying, hey, nothing's off the table, because if you can't think it, it can happen. So let's just brainstorm together what are possibilities, and nobody's at fault. Let's just figure out what the possibilities are and how we can manage them.
Right. And you just said a key point. Nobody's at fault when you brainstorm, because sometimes when we brainstorm those scenarios, we're automatically have faces that pop up about whose fault it might be that happened. And I think it's really important that we take that off the table, because if you don't take it off the table, then people get protective of their turf and they don't want to talk about it. So if you can talk about it in a faceless manner, I think it really helps a lot.
I agree. The same goes, and I know I've probably said this before, but even we do exercises like crisis simulations, and I find that often at the end of the simulation, there's some sort of disconnect. If the simulation didn't go as everybody thought it would, according to the plan, according to the team, and according to their experience, something happened, and you look for the disconnect. What was that? That key moment in time that disconnect was made, which made you not be able to manage the crisis simulation as you thought you would have been able to. And a lot of people then think that me, as the debriefer who's been the fly on the wall through the exercise, is going to pinpoint the person who didn't do their role properly or who lacked something, and it's not that. It's not about the person. It's about the role. Perhaps that crisis role is not defined properly, or isn't given to not the right person, but maybe that person within their role has too many has too many jobs or duties on their shoulders that it got disconnected. So it's not about who was wrong. It's about what in the plan can we fix to make it sure that it doesn't happen again.
Yes, I totally agree. I think that, and the other thing is too, and you've probably gone through enough crises as I have to understand this, and I believe very strongly, I should say this, in tabletop exercises, I think it's a difference maker in how people approach crisis, because I've worked with both. I've worked with people who have excellent preparation and no preparation, and always the people with excellent preparation do better. But when I sit down with the people that have had excellent preparation after the fact, they are the first to admit it didn't go like we thought it would. Mm-hmm. And so it never goes like you think it's going to, but it's always better if you've prepared.
Absolutely.
Because I think for me, the thing that you take off the table with preparation, and this is why, you can hear me probably banging the drum. I am passionate about crisis preparation services a lot more than I am about crisis management. Unfortunately, I think in our business, you get called more for the management side than you do for the preparation side. But I've seen what happens when people go through tabletop and preparation. They find a way to remove the emotional turmoil, a lot of it, I should say, from the actual crisis. In other words, if they know that this is what's going to happen, if they understand the cycle of crisis, if they know they're going to get crucified, if they understand that these things are going to happen, they're able to cut to the quick faster. They're able to remove the emotion that's going to guide some poor decision making faster and get back to what really needs to be talked about. And to me, this is the most valuable thing. And I agree that we need to define, we use the FEMA plan or however triage response or however you want to do it. People need to understand the system going in. They do. They need to understand that. But if they can get that kind of monkey off their back so that they don't have to struggle with the system and with their emotions at the same time, they're going to be a lot better off, because I think they can manage their emotions better. Because I've never seen a crisis, have you, that didn't involve emotion of some kind?
Oh, whether it's from your external audience, the victims of the crisis and the emotion there, or no matter what, there's emotion because you're close to the organization. Especially as leaders within an organization, this is a big part of your life, if not your baby that you created from scratch. So it's impossible to remove the emotion.
I agree. And of course, as we all know, their emotion can be a pretty strong factor in decision making. So I think if you've already pre-made some decisions, I know years ago there was a really beneficial program in the United States called Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Mm-hmm. And the basis of that program's success was the idea that you sat down with your kids ahead of time and made a kind of a behavioral contract, not that says I'm not going to drink, but that says if I get in trouble, I'm going to call you. and that removed a lot of the emotion and negativity that comes along when the incident actually happens, because we're sad when it happens. We're sad when our kids get in trouble, they get partying, and they don't have the faculties to be able to drive home, but we're so thankful that they called.
Absolutely.
And it's that same idea that crisis preparation is a lot more key than a lot of people give it, say it is. Don't you think? It's just people are always saying, "Oh, it's never going to happen to me."
And today, with social media and the way that we may not see more crises, but we see a lot more issues, and issues can quickly escalate into
I
crises.
agree.
So social media kind of changed that. Not just that, but the search engines. I mean, when something's published about you, that goes down in search engine history, and that can potentially have an impact on your reputation for the long term. So it's definitely something that's become more, people are more aware of lately. Not every organization, like you said, thinks that it can happen to them. So often they're just not smart in the prep work, and then they get caught in the moment, and they weren't prepared. But which is the point of us, right? Of our blogs and of the podcasts and us communicating our messages as often as we do.
Right. One of the things I see in higher ed, and this is typical for government too, is I think they've got a system that's in place that they're really leery about changing. And for instance, in higher ed and college athletics, we have a press release system, right? We don't, and it's based on traditional media timetables. And so I've worked with universities that are really hesitant about breaking an issue on social media. They don't think that's a good idea. They want to wait and break it via press release through the university's communications office. And I get that. I understand the importance of what they think is managing the message. But anymore, as you stated, we need to get people to understand that if you really want to drive the message, if you want to be the first one that sets the tone for "we are the source," you have to use social media.
It's so important. And
I just
being
don't.
that
Yeah.
source is so important. That's the only way you're going to regain control before it spirals.
Well, I agree. And I think that people that are used to the traditional media cycle where papers come out in the morning and in the evening, or I listen to in the States, it's the 6 o'clock news or whatever, I think we get this idea. The media has this idea too sometimes. I think that they should drive the message. And, we went through that cycle here about maybe 4 or 5 years ago about be your own media. And I think it's most important sometimes in crisis work, because if you don't get out in front of something, if you don't become the source, then you're chasing. You're chasing the news all the time. And I know it's really hard for traditional organizations to be this way. And frankly, a lot of communications people in these organizations don't have that mindset either.
Yeah, it's something that needs to be built over time. And with experience, which is the whole point of planning.
That's true.
You never want to experience a crisis, but in a crisis, you want to have experience. It's like a lose-lose that now with these simulations and these training exercises, we can win at.
Yes, and I agree. And I think, going back to what we talked about earlier, there's something that I do want to emphasize here, because I think there's a little bit of a debate, Melissa, when it comes to who should be your social media manager in a time when an issue pops up. Should it be your regular social media manager, or do you have a team of people that step in and kind of take over? And I think that's a worthy discussion, maybe. I think Absolutely. I wrote a blog piece a while back about that your social media manager is your crisis front line. And I think that a lot of people don't understand that, don't get that. And I see a lot of this in college athletics. I see an awful lot of university athletic departments whose social media managers are young. And before, I get it from all sides, that doesn't mean that I don't think a young person, a person with less experience can be savvy in this kind of thing, but they certainly have to be trained. I think that knowing how to use Facebook and even knowing how to run a successful Twitter campaign, or having a great integrated marketing strategy in your company does not mean that you are ready to handle a crisis. And I'm a big proponent, and it's not because this is what I do, but I do this because I think it's important, of bringing in people either to train your people to make sure that you know what's going on, or to bring people in to come alongside you in a crisis, in a consulting sort of way. I don't think necessarily, unless it's a huge major thing, that they need to come in and take over, unless it's a Penn State kind of a thing. But I do believe that your frontline people need to be trained. There's just such a lack of that, because when we're hiring social media managers, we're looking for that creative. We're looking for the person that has marketing savvy. And not necessarily do they have any kind of PR training at all. And that would, to me, is a must. And then if you want to go a step farther, I think it would be really important for brands to have their community managers trained in crisis prep, just so they can understand issues management. I know I've seen you write on this a lot, and I know you believe it. It's really important to be able to understand the difference between an issue that needs to be addressed and an issue that doesn't.
Absolutely.
And we go the other way. I mean, I've seen it happen, and so have you, on brands all over the internet. The first little sign of negative, and we're apologizing. And I saw a couple of years ago, there was a smaller school in Florida that had an incident with their band members taunting an opposing basketball player, and there was some ethnic slurs involved in the whole situation, and it was a bad situation all the way around. I mean, nobody wants to see their kids in their band or whomever, their fans, if you will, act like that. But I saw this as a perfect example of how an issue escalated because it was handled poorly, not because they weren't active enough, but because they were too proactive. I mean, you can go overboard. They sent out articles, they released press releases, they talked for a couple of weeks or longer about the discipline that was going to be metered out by, the school because of this incident. And by the time they got done speaking in public, it became a national issue. And I think that there's a way to handle issues and there's a way to not handle them. I think that goes both ways. I think you can try and duck. You can do the ostrich routine. And the other thing is you can just go absolutely overboard where you start apologizing for things you actually didn't do. And I don't know. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, too, about how you handle that balance.
Yeah, I'd like to say that I think that's an excellent point that you just brought up. And I like to say that we need to be conscious of what our role is with, or what the expectations of our audiences in an issue and in a crisis, and how to meet those expectations. But we also, and this also comes with that experience that we're talking about and with that prep work, is that we also can't let social media become a bully. And we often see exactly like you're saying, where this first sign of negativity, people are scared of it blowing up, of it turning into a crisis, of the coverage that that it can get, or maybe it could go viral because they see it happen elsewhere, and they're doing exactly what you're saying, and they overreact to it. So a part of that issues management is definitely having the tools, resources, and the training to identify when it is that we need to jump in and communicate, and when also can we let our community do the speaking for us.
Oh, yes, definitely.
And that as well goes with the prep work of developing that community, which is a great crisis preparedness strategy as well.
Oh, and I agree totally. And as a matter of fact, I think that Jeremiah Aoyang, you're familiar with him. He has written a number of articles on research that Altimeter has done on that very subject of creating advocacy with social media, and how a good reputation actually increases your bottom line to the point to where if you actually have a crisis, you'll suffer less monetary damage than if you were not using social media for advocacy. And I think that's a whole nother subject that people really need to understand. One of the things that is a very common mistake, I believe, and I know you've seen this too, is when brands want to jump on social media in a crisis and they have not been there before. And I think that's a danger. And I don't know how you feel about that, but I'm a big proponent of loyalty strategies in social media. I think one of the things that brands need to be doing when they tell their story on social media is you need to be building advocacy. A lot of companies are using it for customer service and for promotions, and that's all great. And a piece of customer service is developing advocacy, especially if you do it like somebody like Zappos does it, and it becomes your reputation. But people need to understand that when you build that advocacy, and if you do end up going into a crisis, you're going to be a lot better off than if you don't. But you can't just use social media like a magic pill. It's not ever going to be a magic pill for anything. And I do agree with you that it can be an awful bully. And I think we need to develop some really thick skin, but we also need to develop something you touched on, and I think that's just plain old savvy and wisdom. You need to be able to read an issue and understand. And I could tell you stories about universities that I've talked to that have really smart community managers that saw something brewing that might have turned into something eventually, but just sat on it for a while just to see how it escalated. And it never did escalate into anything that they really needed to address, and so it went away. And I think we see issues escalate a lot, Melissa, because people don't do that.
Absolutely. We also see, when you're saying that, it's making me think of the case from, at the time that we're recording this, last week, the hotel in Hudson, New York. So that was a case of them actually thinking that they got away with something, because I believe that they posted that statement to their page in September or November of 2013, and it only came out last week, so early August of 2014. So this is a case of the opposite, where they should have been. Their initial statement was, this should have been taken down long ago. Well, I agree. First of all, it never should have been put up, but it should have been taken down long ago. So why didn't you? You didn't because you thought that you were smart and that you would get away with it, or that you had been getting away with it, and you probably thought that it was working. It was scaring people into not writing those negative reviews about you. But look at what happens when the opposite is true as well.
Oh, that's such a huge customer service issue. I mean, I hate to keep kind of saying this over and over again, but honestly, what are people thinking? I just don't get how you can't think that through. It's so unhuman, if you will.
I think it goes down to, and I agree with you, but I think that when it comes down to the personality of those responsible for those messages and for those decision makings. It's like the case of last year we saw Amy's Baking Company. They were on that chef's TV show, Kitchen Nightmares, and huge thing blew up. And you can't train people like that. It's just, they don't put their customers first. They put themselves first, and they have these massive egos and these, quick mouths that just get them into trouble. You can't train people like that. So it's on one side, it's what were you thinking, but on the other side, that's their nature, and they're just bound to get caught in it eventually.
I agree. I think that can happen. I think that, business people are people. Absolutely. CEOs are people. So coaches are people, and they do make people errors. So it's and I've seen, I've trained kids, I've trained coaches, and I've seen them turn around and do the unthinkable. So it's, you can only do so much. But I think the important thing for me in that situation is, again, you're going back to the blind spots, the risk analysis things of thinking things through from the beginning. We kind of live in our own world. We're crisis PR people, so we know all this stuff. But when you go outside of our world, there's very few people that understand what we understand. So I get that we can't expect them to think all these things through. But so we keep broadcasting and putting up the megaphone and saying, please try and get your people trained and do your risk analysis and practice your crisis management.
Here's how. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now go do it.
Yeah, and sometimes people, even though they hear it, at least at the university and school level that I work with, they're already overwhelmed before they brought you in for training. So the idea that you're going to create a new to-do list for them is really kind of, it can be something that they turn around and say after you're gone, oh, that's really great, but it's not realistic. So it's a matter sometimes, I think, of going into a client and looking at their culture and saying what pieces of this are most needy. We would call this risk analysis, and prioritize what you're going to do first, what you have to do now to survive, what you could do that would make your bottom line better, and your kind of wish list on the bottom. And I think that's it's a simplified version of a risk analysis report, but that's kind of how we go in. And I think we have to be careful that we don't overwhelm people, because I've gone into universities where they don't know what they're doing at all, but they're really willing to learn, so they're willing to put the time in, I guess. And then I've gone into places where they really don't, they're not doing it right, but they think they are, and they're not going to listen. It's just like you said, they're not trainable. So those people, you kind of have to, wish them well and hope that they don't call you again.
It's funny that you say that. I think we've all experienced cases like that where it just isn't a good fit.
Yes, definitely. That's part of it, because, not everybody's cut out to hear our message. No. They're just not. And some of them, honestly, some organizations are doing it already inherently. I mean, it's in place just because they know it's the right thing to do. And they've got a good understanding of what's going on out there. But I still keep kind of drifting back, if you will, to that idea of just, if we could give one takeaway in this whole message, it would be, please get your frontline people trained. That's got to be something that everybody has to get through their head, that it's very important, and that will lessen your chance of having a crisis. And I think when I go in and I talk to people about crisis preparedness, I always have to, there has to be a value there. So what is the value of crisis preparedness? Well, number one, the value is monetary, and we can prove that. We've got lots of data to show that it's inevitable that you're going to have an issue somewhere along the line, and if you prepare for it, your bottom line is not going to be affected as much as if you just go through life thinking it's never going to happen to you. So it's either going to do one of two things. It's going to save you money, or it's going to make you money. And that I've found when you're talking to people about crisis preparedness, crisis management, risk analysis, you really have to answer those two value questions for them, or they're not really interested.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's not close to home yet.
Right. And of course, everybody, sometimes when people have crises, then they do call you in. But if they've got no prep work, if they don't have trained people, it becomes really tough going for them. And I feel for people. I really do, because I think sometimes people get blindsided by issues that they didn't think would be a problem, and then they just don't know what to do. They just have no idea where the life preservers are.
Well, like you said, it's not part of their everyday. It's part of ours, so it's easy for us, but it's not part of their everyday. And we do tend to overwhelm them sometimes because they hire us to do this really important but very big task, and they have a million other things on their plate as well. So whereas us, we're just looking at this one factor and this one part of their business, and they're looking at everything else that they have to do on top of now what the to-do list that we just gave them.
Right. If you don't mind, I'm just going to I'd like to just kind of give some takeaways here real quick, because I know when we have an audience like this, it's great, that we talk about this stuff. And I want to just say a couple of concrete things here, because I get asked this question a lot, and people ask me, what are the priorities in crisis preparedness? And I just want to spiel off a few, because I think there are some, I don't necessarily think they're more important than others, but there are some really key ones for me. Excellent. And that's that, number one, you need to have an understanding and a commitment to triage response. And for people that don't understand what that means, that just means you should know what you can and can't respond to or don't want to respond to, when to ignore something that isn't an issue, and who should respond to what. There has to be a higher up chain for higher up answers. That's kind of what we call triage response. It's a medical term for taking care of the most important cases first. Number two, I would really think that you want to train people how to recognize the warning signs of a crisis. And to me, this goes right to the idea of having a social media listening system set up, a monitoring system.
Which I definitely want to talk about as well after.
Yeah, let's do that. That's really important. Number 3, you need to know how to, and this is key for me, Melissa, and I don't know how you feel about this, but I think you need to know how to speak and think in the third person as opposed to the first person. Because I think an effective social media manager always communicates in a brand voice, not as an individual. Now, we're not talking about a CEO here. We're not talking about a real face. We're talking about a community manager that doesn't own the company but is speaking on behalf of the company. And number 4, I think you have to have a general understanding of how a crisis cycle moves and know how to read volume and sentiment. I think those are much overlooked things. And the last thing, I think, number 5, is you have to be able to operate professionally under pressure in real time. I think there's a lot of people that can operate professionally under pressure if they can go into their office and think about it for a couple hours or maybe overnight or whatever. But the key to crisis is being able to operate under pressure in real time. And I found that some people are better than this than others. And I just kind of wanted to throw those things out there because I think that they need to be said. So.
Absolutely. And I think it was your number 3, the operating in the third person or communicating in third person. Another great, I think that's an excellent, well, I think they're all excellent points, but this one in particular, because you don't want to say, when you do want to say we, and you don't just mean your internal staff or the organization, you mean your community as well. So when you include them within, we are grieving for the loss of, or we are, something about making a mistake and
here's how we're going to fix it.
Yeah, and we realize that we were wrong. You're also including, of course, the community wasn't wrong, but you're making it about your community and about everybody rather than just about yourself. And that's so important to communicate empathy and compassion.
Right.
So
Very much so.
I really like those 5 points. So, Chris, let's talk about monitoring, because I think that I get these questions all the time of, what do we monitor for and what should we use? We're a small organization or we're a large organization and we aren't paying for those, mega big monitoring tools. And often my message is sometimes in a crisis, you have to have that as a backup. You have to have those, bigger monitoring tools that will analyze the important data and provide it to you so that you can continue to be on point and continue to address concerns and rumors before they spiral out of control. So let's talk a little bit about that, because I know you do a lot of that for organizations.
Right, I do. And my mantra always is people are talking about you whether you listen or not. So I think that, you start with that as step 1. Your presence isn't a requirement to people talking about you. So we all know that from childhood. But I think, first of all, when I go to talk about monitoring, I want to let people know what the benefits are, because I think if you put the benefits up front, it makes more sense when you talk about what you should be monitoring and how you should be doing it. But I think when it comes to crisis PR, I think one of the biggest benefits is just being able to discover early warning signs of negative or false information that can trigger a crisis if they're left unattended. I think that's one of the biggest benefits. Another benefit is that if you do this over, as a regular business operation, one of the things you'll be able to do over time is identify your key critics and your watchdogs. I think that's really important. You need to know who these people are in social media. Also, on the other side of that, you can identify who your key influencers and advocates are, because they can be a big help to you when you need them in a crisis. Another benefit is just to identify which social media channels best suit your fans and your organizational culture. And if you just think, well, I've got a crisis, I'm going to jump on Twitter, and none of your fans are on Twitter, they're all over on Facebook or on Instagram or somewhere else, you need to figure that out. And I think if you're doing monitoring as a culture, you'll follow that. Another benefit is you'll know what your competitors are up to. and I know that's not a big deal for everybody, but I think it is, because knowing who your competitors and what their messages are and what they're saying is important, because they could be talking about you. So in some of the things that they're up to might be trending in your sector as well. So you really need to listen to that.
And not just that, sorry, if I could just add in.
No, go ahead.
If there's an industry, if they're facing a crisis that affects your industry, you need to know about that, because it might be inappropriate for you to keep your marketing messages going.
Oh, I agree. And not only that, but you can learn from them. You
Absolutely.
can watch them when they go through something and then you can learn lessons. And it's a lot better to learn them from watching somebody else than to learn it yourself. But anyway, and I think the other big benefit, again, that you and I talked about earlier, but it's uncomfortable for people, is one of the benefits of listening is that you can listen to yourself and you get to uncover you. This will help you uncover blind spots that your organization might have. So those are a lot of the benefits. And then, another question I get asked a lot is, what should we be listening to? And I think that's really important. And I think there's 6 key conversations that you should monitor in your listening strategy. This is just important for everybody. I don't care what sector you are. They're just important. And the first one is, you need to be listening to conversations about your brand. You need to listen to what is being said in the digital space about your brand. It's important to understand your regular sentiment score. So if you regularly have 75% positive to 15% negative to the remaining percent neutral, then that's pretty good. If your sentiment is running kind of 50-50 and there is no neutral, to me, that's a yellow flag. That's something that should show up in a risk analysis. I think there should always be a good percentage of neutral conversations about your brand. I know everybody's looking for those positive conversations, but they're not always in the numbers that you would like. This also helps you to find your influencers and your watchdogs, and I think that's really important. I think the second conversation that we're overlooking more and more, that we have to be really careful about overlooking, is we need to listen to conversations about our brand in traditional media. And I know back when I first started in marketing and journalism years ago, we used to have clipping services. You're probably too young to even know what they are.
I know what they are, but they haven't been around since I've been.
Yeah,
in the field.
no, they're old school. And basically that's a service who you would hire to go around and clip newspaper articles out of papers that are talking about you. And of course, now social and digital media has streamlined that process so well that we can do that ourselves. But you do need to pay attention to traditional media, especially in certain sectors where traditional media really still carries some weight. And there are a lot of sectors in certain business sectors that traditional media is much more important still than social media is. I know that's hard to believe, but there are. There's a lot of sectors that aren't just present in social media as much as they are. I think another conversation that's really important to listen to is to listen to your core influencers. Listen to people who sing your praises, that come to your defense, or simply recommend you to other people. They're the people that are your influence graph. I think you need to know your enemies as well. They are the dark side of your core influencers, but you need to understand where those people will jump into the conversation and where they won't. And this goes back to something that you and I talked about earlier, and that's relying on an engaged community to come to your defense in a crisis. Melissa, this was one thing that I thought was really interesting in the Penn State crisis a couple of years ago. I watched this and monitored it very closely in the first 48 hours of the crisis, and it was amazing to me how the chatter about this was kept down on social media, because they had so many very dedicated core influencers that kept the conversation realistic. They didn't let things run wild. There was speculation and rumors and all. There was a lot of talk. Don't make any mistake about that. And it wasn't all positive. But when you have core influencers that are on there that you can listen to, you and understand where they jump into the conversation, I think that helps you sometimes in crisis management when you're in the throes of a crisis, because you know that in certain issues at certain points you're going to gain some ground because your advocates are going to come to your defense. So I think you need to follow them and listen to them. Another thing that you should be monitoring, another conversation, and this is one that's really overlooked too. We could have a whole podcast about this, but you need to listen to your internal conversations. Listen to what your employees think about your organization? Do they have the freedom to speak on your behalf? I think you need to identify internal constituents that can become ambassadors for you. That's really important to your customers too, especially if you're in retail products, is that they need to know that you've got internal people that are on their side. So if you've got really good customer management, again, a service like I mentioned earlier, Zappos, they've got great online customer service. If you've got an organization like that, your fans are going to feel more confident in a crisis because they know they've got somebody that's on their side. And because customer service people play both sides of the fence, and I don't think we get that. Lots of times, if you've got really good customer service people, they are the ones that really understand what your fans are saying, and they'll be a great help to you in a crisis. So listen to those conversations. Another one that I think is really key conversation, and we talked about this earlier, is competition. You need to know what they're up to. And I think the last one is a little bit broader than your competition, and that's your sector. For instance, if I'm in higher education, my direct competitors might be just people in my region because we're all vying for the same students to come to our schools. But really, when I talk about listening to sector conversations, I'm talking about listening to thought leaders and leaders online, and because they might be saying or recommending some resources that can help you. So I always recommend that people follow their sector news, follow sector influencers, when you talk about conversations. So I think those are 6 key conversations you should always monitor. And then depending on your sector or whether you're business to business or business to consumer, it might look a little different.
Excellent. And so why don't you talk a little bit about the difference between monitoring all of these things in normal times? I have parentheses around normal, and then monitoring everything in a crisis. So what is the difference that people should be aware of and should be prepared for?
Well, that's a great question, because the 6 conversations that I just talked about are everyday monitoring. This is part of your culture. And what that monitoring does, before I answer the question you just said, was what that monitoring does is it informs your strategy. If you're savvy and listening and know everything about your brand in new media and traditional media, if you understand your core influencers and when they'll jump in, if you have a good handle on your internal conversations, your competition, and your sector, then you're ready to monitor in crisis. Because in crisis, you're not necessarily going to be monitoring all those conversations in the same way you would in an everyday. So for instance, let's just take core influencers as an example. So when I monitor core influencers every day on a regular basis, I'm listening more to conversations. I'm trying to look at places where they're going to jump into conversations. Are they more likely to be proactive? Are they more likely to just come in when we do something good? And are they quiet when we do something bad? I want to understand, if you will, their behaviors, so that when it comes to a crisis, I know that I can maybe watch a few people that I know are going to jump in, and then I might be able to contact those people offline and give them early information so that they know that something's coming. And I know there's a whole conversation about that as well, but that's just one example. I think you still listen to all the same groups, but you're listening to them differently, because the core, the hub, if you will, of the wheel in a crisis is your issue. And so the spokes that come off of that are all the consequences of what that issue produces. Are there deaths? Is there physical harm involved? Was there monetary loss? Is this a moral crisis? There's all those spokes that come off that produce these different conversations, because when you have a moral crisis, the conversation is going to be totally different than when you're an airline and you have a crash.
Absolutely.
And so we need to understand that. And if we understand who we are and who our fans are, we'll get that. And so when you're talking about listening in a crisis, we're listening for different types of conversations, but the same categories. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It makes perfect sense. Basically, you need to know everything that is in relation to your organization in the general public and with all of your stakeholders, internal and external, in order for you to be able to even grasp how it's differing, how it's escalating, what's being said and what the impact may be long term on the organization in a crisis.
Right. I think that oftentimes, too, in a crisis, there are sector people who will speak up that might be giving you little hints about what you should and shouldn't do. And I think oftentimes that'll come in the form of a retweet, that's something that you did well. I think, too, also going back to the core influencers, there are in understanding how these people work when a crisis comes along, there's going to be a very large group in this little sub-conversation that's going to go away in a crisis. They're not going to talk. And the reason is because a lot of people are more willing to come to talk about you when things are going well, but when things are going bad, they don't want to talk because they don't want to be identified with you. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't like you and that they're going away forever. It just means that people have different levels of buy-in when it comes to how proactive they're going to be when their own reputation is on the line. So if you have, for instance, I work with a lot of sports teams. And there's nobody on earth that I have ever found that's more highly invested in a brand than sports fans are. And I mean, I can love a product, but if a product comes along and they've got great service and they're offering their service for a lot less money, I may just change and go over there. But if I went to a college and graduated from there, and that's my college, I'm always going to be that way. So there's a different level of buy-in too with influencers depending on what your product is. And so I just think that people need to understand when we're talking about monitoring crisis in real time, we're looking more at things like volume, sentiment, escalation, and defining new information. We're looking at identifying negative or misinformation. I think one of the things that I did that really helped me understand this is I had a client 3 years ago that had a viral crisis that was global. I mean, bam, it blew up overnight. It was on NBC News. It was everywhere. And it was because it involved ethnic slur and that the CEO made inadvertently one night when he was tired and got on Facebook and saw something and just said something. It was stupid. And to this day, I still don't know if he knows it was stupid. But the one thing I learned in there is that you need to be able to identify right away those pockets of conversation that are going to come up that you've got to let go. There's always going to be watchdogs that are going to come on and they're going to just spew. I call them kind of like a swarm of bees because they're like people that hang out on Reddit. No offense to any listeners that hang out on Reddit, but they're people that are looking for issues. They've got their little issues and they're going to come in a swarm and they're going to sting and they're going to bite and then they're going to go away. Because a week from now, there's going to be another issue that's going to come along, and they're going to do the same thing. They're going to sting, they're going to bite, and they're going to go away. So one of the things that I did during this crisis was I was able to identify people that I thought really had legitimate questions. They weren't interested in just saying, you're a so-and-so and then go away and never come back. So what I did was I reached out to selected people offline and I messaged them if I thought that they had a really legitimate question, and I answered the question for them, and 9 times out of 10 they came back and said, I really don't like what you did, but thanks for answering my question. I really appreciate it. And they never showed up on the Facebook thread again. And sometimes I think that we need to really have this understanding of what kind of behaviors there are out there, and you always need to be willing to go offline and talk to people. And honestly, I can tell you in that crisis, I didn't answer everybody that tried to contact us offline because I usually just looked at the question, and if it was just another attempt to spew, I just left it alone.
That's important to be able to identify as well.
Yes, but sometimes people do just want to know that, what really happened here? I heard this and this and this, or they've been the carrier of a big piece of misinformation and they just want to know, can you set this straight? And you can set it straight, but I don't always think it's a good idea to necessarily do that in public, because I think individual people have questions that they're answering for their own purposes, or they want answered for their own purposes. And you don't need to make a big show of going on Facebook and answering every single question that you think should be answered online so everybody can see it. Because sometimes people don't like that either. It's kind of like, you're guessing what will turn some people's switches. But I find that taking conversations offline in a crisis is sometimes important. If you've got the manpower and the time to do that, I would suggest that you really keep on the look for people that you think have really legitimate questions that need to be answered. Also, another way of monitoring in real time that's really important, Melissa, I think, is keeping an eye on the media just to make sure that they are not giving out any misinformation. And that is definitely, I can tell you right now, that's definitely an offline conversation. I never tell a media person in public that they're spewing misinformation. I always take that offline because I think they will respect you more if you don't call them out in public.
That's media relations. You don't want to stir something up with somebody who has authority to write on a very big news site or blog site that you don't want to anger them against the organization. That's just a respect thing.
Right. And just one more thing I wanted to expand on here with core influencers. I have, in some instances in a crisis, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this after I just say this little ditty here. I have reached out to core influencers online, especially bloggers, and kept them abreast of information that we aren't always going to be really detailed about in public, just for their own information so that they can know that there's something that's coming, or this piece of information came out and we haven't been able to verify it yet. I just wanted you to know this. Every conversation that we have in a crisis isn't going to happen online.
And it shouldn't happen online. Online is where you communicate your key messages that you want the general public and your external stakeholders to know and be aware of, to keep them apprised and to keep your organization as the resource. So people keep coming back to you for more information. But a lot happens behind the scenes and needs to happen behind the scenes that you don't necessarily need to share with the whole world.
Oh, I agree. But how many times have you seen community managers call out people?
Yeah, it goes back to the training.
Yeah, I agree.
And choosing the right people.
Yeah. It's just too bad. I think some people sometimes they think once something is out on social media, they think everything needs to be said on social media. And I think in a crisis, that's a really bad, that's a bad precept to operate under.
Absolutely. I have one last question that I know is probably on the tip of everybody's tongue before I ask you to share all of your wonderful links that people can find you, Chris, is what tools do you recommend? Free tools, paid tools, examples of each, that people should and could use, and how do they determine what tools are best for them for monitoring?
Okay, that's another great question. And I have a kind of a two-part answer here because I think that because of my experience, I think that you have to have knowledge of the whole toolbox, but you don't have to use the whole toolbox. And when I say that, I mean, if I'm not speaking at an enterprise level right now, I'm speaking more for smaller corporates and universities and, organizations that have hundreds of employees, but don't necessarily need enterprise tools on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. If you don't need a Radian 6 that's going to cost you, over $1,000 a month, I wouldn't operate on that on a regular basis. But some people use it regularly because they need the multifaceted abilities for Salesforce and other things, that are incorporated into that. But in terms of monitoring social media, I think that if you're doing it on a regular basis, I really do think that you can get by fairly inexpensively just by by piecing together a toolbox, if you will, with things like Hootsuite, Social Mention, some of these other tools that offer free services but aren't maybe as deep as if you actually get in the throes of a crisis. And I think if one of your main channels is Twitter, I think that Twitter is just easy to monitor for free because you can use Hootsuite for free or TweetDeck, and not really, you'll get all the information that you need there, and most oftentimes faster than you'll get with an enterprise tool like Radian 6 where there's a little lag in real time. Radian 6 and Meltwater, all those enterprise level tools are great tools in a crisis because you get so many layers of data that you need: sentiment analysis, volume, escalation. You need to be able to segment out groups of bloggers, of people, of all your influencer groups, your watchdogs, and those things. So a larger enterprise tool is really great, but unless you can afford that $500 plus ticket a month, you're going to have to be familiar with what they are and maybe bring them in during a crisis. And the easiest way to do that is just to bring in somebody that's already using those, like a professional. But let's go back to what you can do in your business. Now, for my clients, I use Hootsuite, and I use Sprout Social, which is an inexpensive social media tool which has a lot of data. But there's a lot of Sprout Socials out there. I'm not affiliated with the company, so I'm not promoting them. But I use that because I've used it for a long time, and it gives me all the information I need. It's a multiple admin tool, and you want to look for that. You want to look for a tool, and Hootsuite has this too. If you want to pay, they have a very low-level monthly payment that will allow you to use multiple admins. But you need a multiple admin tool so that more than one person can be logging in and looking at data at a time, especially if you have more than one business operation. I may have customer service and I may have sales. They need to have their own admin login. So there's a lot of great tools out there that you can kind of piece together, and I sort of go through a cycle, if you want to call it that. I have a certain time of the day, 3 times a day, that I look at clients' social media chatter in at least 2 tools, maybe 3, depending on the time of the year, and see what's being said about them. And then it becomes a routine, and it's easy to go through. But you don't have to spend anything, I don't think, if you just really want to dip your toe in and see how valuable it is. Facebook Insights are a great help. And Facebook is not real generous with their API, so you're not going to get a lot of really great tools out there for monitoring Facebook besides what they've already given you. But that's kind of a nutshell look at monitoring services.
Excellent. Thank you. Chris, this has been an awesome conversation. Where can people find and follow you?
Well, thanks. First of all, I want to thank you for having me, because I don't get to do this very often. I don't get to talk to my peers. So this is really great for me. And to have an audience as valuable as yours is a really great treat for me. But I'm online. My website is just simply cksyme.com. That's CKSYME.com. And all of my contact information is there, in addition to some of the services that we do as an agency. And you can email me at chris@cksyme.com. I'm on Twitter @cksyme. I'm also on LinkedIn at Chris Syme, and on Google Plus at Chris Syme, all one word. And I also have a Pinterest account that's on Chris Syme too. Then there's a great board there where I have a lot of social media infographics. So plus you'll see some of my personal stuff too. But so that gives you an idea. And I want to thank you again, Melissa, for the opportunity to do this. It's really been fun.
I agree. And thank you for taking the time to chat with me. This has been, I think that you did a really great job at answering questions that I know people just are always curious to know the answers to. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this week's episode of the Crisis Intelligence Podcast. We appreciate all of your support, so if you could share this podcast with colleagues, friends, or anybody that you think would benefit from listening to it, we'd really appreciate you doing so. Also, if you could head on over to iTunes and or Stitcher to leave us a review so that other people who are interested in listening to the podcast can hear directly from you on what to expect and what you think of the podcast, we would really appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions on topics of crisis communication that you'd like to hear us discuss, feel free to email us anytime at crisis@agnesday.com. Thank you so much for tuning in this week, and I look forward to talking even more crisis intelligence with you next Sunday.